In the gleaming lobby of Sterling Dynamics Corporation, a humble woman in a thrift store suit was about to face the most brutal job interview of her life. What started as a desperate search for employment took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a CEO who recognized her true identity. Maureen Robinsons wasn't your typical night janitor applying for a secretary position. For 8 years, she had spent her life hiding in plain sight after a family tragedy, known for being the mysterious founding president of a rival tech empire who had vanished without a trace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the thin walls of apartment 4B at exactly 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Maureen Robinsons had set it to ring. She was already awake, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had grown incrementally larger over the past 8 years, like her guilt. Her hand found the clock before the second beep, silencing it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to live quietly, invisible. The morning ritual began as it always did, methodical, unremarkable, designed to blend into the background of a world that no longer looked for her. She padded across the worn linoleum floor to the kitchenette, her bare feet avoiding the loose tile that would announce her presence to Miss Garcia downstairs. Coffee first, black and bitter from the discount brand that came in generic packaging. The luxury of cream had disappeared with her old life, along with mahogany boardrooms and personal assistants who knew her order by heart. As the coffee brewed, Maureen caught her reflection in the toaster's chrome surface, a distorted mirror that seemed appropriate for who she'd become. Gray roots showing beneath the box-dyed brown hair, lines etched deeper by 8 years of night shifts and fluorescent lighting. Her hands, once manicured for million-dollar handshakes, now bore the calluses of industrial cleaning supplies and the permanent scent of disinfectant. The phone buzzed once on the counter, a burner model she replaced every 6 months. The text was from Marcus. "Weather looks clear for your appointment today. Umbrella still in the car if needed." She typed back quickly, "Thanks, we'll call if it rains." To anyone else, it would seem like a caring friend checking on her job interview. But Maureen knew Marcus Thompson was asking if she still intended to go through with the Sterling Dynamics evaluation, and confirming that her extraction plan remained in place. 8 years of coded conversations had given them a language all their own. The closet held exactly 7 outfits, 6 sets of janitor uniforms in various stages of wear, and 1 charcoal gray suit that had seen better decades. She'd bought it 3 years ago at Goodwill for $12, thinking she might need it someday for a funeral or a court date. Never for this. The fabric was polyester masquerading as wool, with shoulder pads that had gone out of style before the millennium, but it was clean and pressed. It would have to do. As she dressed, Maureen's reflection showed a different woman than the one who had awakened an hour earlier. The suit, despite its thrift store origins, restored some measure of her former bearing. Her shoulders straightened automatically, muscle memory from hundreds of board meetings reasserting itself. For a moment, she looked almost like the woman who had once commanded an empire from the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower. Almost. The makeup came next, drugstore foundation to even her complexion, mascara to define eyes that had once been called penetrating by Fortune magazine. She avoided looking too closely at those eyes in the mirror. They held too many secrets. Too much knowledge of what she was really doing today. Her purse was a practical black vinyl thing, bought for functionality rather than fashion. Inside, next to her Metro card and a worn wallet containing exactly $37, was a folder with copies of a resume that was more fiction than fact. According to the carefully crafted document, Maureen Robinson, know us, a small rebellion against complete erasure of her identity, had spent the last 8 years working various administrative and cleaning positions, with gaps explained by family caregiving responsibility. The truth was far more complex. She walked the subway with the measured pace of someone who had learned to be invisible. The morning commuters rushed past her, executives in tailored suits, young professionals clutching expensive coffee, all of them radiating the kind of urgency that had once defined her life. None of them looked twice at the middle-aged woman in the discount suit. They saw only what they expected: another working-class woman heading to another thankless job. If they had looked closer, they might have noticed the way she analyzed the crowd flow, identifying efficiency bottlenecks in the subway system. They might have observed how her eyes automatically assessed the structural integrity of the station's support beams, or how she calculated optimal positioning for the security cameras, but they didn't look closer. People rarely did. The train was crowded, filled with the usual morning mix of service workers heading to clean the offices that the professionals would later occupy. Maureen found herself sitting next to Elena, who cleaned the 20th floor of a financial services building downtown. They'd ridden together sporadically for 3 years, sharing the comfortable silence of people who understood the weight of invisible labor. "Job interview today?" Elena asked in accented English, gesturing at Maureen's suit. "Secretary position," Maureen replied, her voice carrying just the right note of nervous hope. It wasn't entirely a lie. "You'll do good," Elena said with conviction. "You're smart, I can tell." The compliment hit harder than it should have. 8 years ago, Maureen's intelligence had been profiled in Harvard Business Review and dissected by industry analysts. Now it was noticed by a cleaning woman who had probably never finished high school but possessed the wisdom to see past "Thank you," Maureen said, meaning it more than Elena could know. The phone buzzed again as the train pulled into her station. Another text from Marcus. Package delivered to the usual location. Contents as discussed. She deleted the message immediately. Marcus had placed the Sterling Dynamics financial reports obtained through channels that would remain unnamed in a dead drop she would retrieve later. She'd need them to complete her real assessment of David Sterling's company. As she climbed the subway steps into the morning sunlight, Maureen pulled out a small photo from her wallet. It was creased from handling, the edges worn soft. Emma smiled back at her from behind cracked glass, 16 years old, wearing her school uniform, eyes bright with the kind of faith children have in their parents before life teaches them otherwise. The photo had been taken 3 weeks before the accident. 3 weeks before Maureen's obsession with a hostile takeover had kept her at the office instead of picking up her daughter from a friend's house. 3 weeks before Emma decided to walk home in the rain because her mother was too busy to answer her phone. Maureen's hand trembled slightly as she put the photo away. Today would test everything she'd built over the past 8 years, the careful facade, the hidden empire, the delicate balance between penance and power. Sterling Dynamics Corporation rose before her like a glass and steel monument to the world she'd once ruled, the world that had cost her everything that truly mattered. The building's lobby bustled with the kind of purposeful energy that had once been her natural habitat. Security guards in navy blazers, executives checking phones while waiting for elevators, the subtle hum of commerce and ambition that she could feel in her bones. It would be so easy to slip back into that rhythm, to let her true self emerge from behind the mask of humility she'd worn for 8 years. But that wasn't why she was here. Not entirely. Maureen Robinsons took a deep breath, adjusted the strap of her vinyl purse, and walked through the revolving doors of Sterling Dynamics Corporation. She had a role to play, that of a desperate woman seeking employment. What she was really there to do was far more complicated: to decide whether David Sterling's company deserved to survive, or if it should join the long list of corporations that had fallen before Phoenix Industries' hidden mine. The receptionist glanced up as she approached, and Maureen saw the immediate assessment in the young woman's eyes, cataloging her cheap suit, her nervous demeanor, her obvious place in the corporate food chain. It was exactly what she'd expected, exactly what she'd prepared for. The game was about to begin. The Hidden President Part 2, The Gauntlet of Judgment. The receptionist's nameplate read, Rebecca Chen, and her smile was as polished as the marble reception desk she sat behind. But Maureen caught the subtle way Rebecca's eyes lingered on her outdated suit, the slight pause before she spoke, the almost imperceptible shift in posture that suggested she was looking at something distasteful. "You must be here for the secretary position," Rebecca said, her tone carrying just enough condescension to sting while maintaining plausible deniability. "Miss Robinson, right?" "Yes, that's correct." Maureen kept her voice steady, channeling the nervous hopefulness of someone who needed this job desperately. It wasn't entirely an act. She did need something from Sterling Dynamics, just not what they assumed. Rebecca made a show of shuffling through papers on her desk, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, but I don't see your appointment in our system. Are you sure you have the right date?" The lie was smooth. Maureen recognized the tactic: make the applicant doubt themselves, establish superiority from the first interaction. She'd seen it done countless times in her previous life, though she'd been too insulated by her executive status to witness its cruelty firsthand. "I confirmed yesterday," Maureen said, allowing a note of anxiety to creep into her voice. The confirmation email said, 9:30 a.m. "Oh, I see it now," Rebecca said after another deliberately long pause, as if the appointment had materialized through Maureen's sheer persistence rather than existing all along. "Please have a seat in the waiting area. Someone will be with you short." The waiting area was a study in psychological manipulation, uncomfortable chairs positioned to face away from the windows, outdated magazines fanned across a coffee table, like a deck of cards. No one wanted to play. 5 other candidates sat in various states of anxiety, their postures screaming desperation despite their efforts to appear confident. Maureen chose a seat near the back where she could observe without being observed. The other candidates were younger, their suits newer, their resumes undoubtedly filled with fresh degrees and internships at companies that mattered. She was meant to feel out of place here, and she played the part, fidgeting with her purse strap and glancing nervously at the elevator bank. "First time applying somewhere this prestigious?" The question came from a woman in her 30s, wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than Maureen's monthly rent. Her smile held the particular cruelty of someone who'd never known real hardship. "Yes," Maureen replied quietly. "I'm a bit nervous." "You should be," another candidate chimed in, a young man with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch. "They don't usually consider people without proper experience for positions here." The casual cruelty was breathtaking in its efficiency. These people, competing for the same position, had instinctively identified the weakest member of their pack and begun circling. Maureen recognized the behavior. She'd seen it in boardrooms, though there it was usually wrapped in corporate speak and strategic position. "What kind of experience do you have?" Navy suit asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer would be inadequate. Maureen launched into her carefully rehearsed background: administrative work, cleaning services, gaps for family care. With each detail, the other candidates' expressions grew more dismissive. She was no threat to them, just an aging woman who'd clearly lost her way and ended up somewhere she didn't belong. What they didn't see was how her eyes cataloged every detail of the corporate environment around her. The way the security cameras were positioned for optimal coverage, the traffic patterns of employees moving through the lobby, the subtle signs of a company under financial stress: fewer fresh flowers, cheaper coffee in the employee break area visible through glass wall, the barely perceptible tension in the security guards' postures. 45 minutes passed before Rebecca finally called her name, the delay clearly intentional. The other candidates had been taken in order of arrival, except for Maureen, who'd been made to wait last despite being third to arrive. "Ms. Robinson, Ms. Hayes will see you now." The elevator ride to the 15th floor was a study in corporate intimidation. Rebecca stood beside her in pointed silence, occasionally checking her phone with the practiced boredom of someone who'd escorted countless inappropriate candidates to their inevitable rejection. Jennifer Hayes's office was a testament to middle management ambition: expensive furniture that wasn't quite executive level, diplomas and awards carefully arranged to impress a view of the city that was good but not great. Hayes herself was younger than Maureen had expected, probably late 20s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having truly failed at anything. "Please, sit," Hayes said without looking up from Maureen's resume. Her tone suggested she was already disappointed by what she was reading. The preliminary questions were brutal in their assumption. Hayes asked about gaps in employment as if they were moral failings, questioned Maureen's ability to fit in with our corporate culture, and made repeated references to the high standards Sterling Dynamics maintained. "I have to ask," Hayes said, finally looking up with an expression of barely concealed disdain, "what makes you think you're qualified for a position at a company like Sterling Dynamics? Your background is unconventional for our standards." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maureen felt the familiar surge of anger, not at the question itself, but at the casual assumption that someone's worth could be measured by their address or the brand of their clothing. It was the same attitude that had cost her daughter's life, the same obsession with status and appearances that had driven her to prioritize work over everything that truly mattered. "I'm a hard worker," Maureen said simply. "I learn quickly, and I understand the value of doing a job well, no matter what that job is." Hayes's laugh was sharp and humorless. "That's admirable, I suppose, but we're looking for someone who can represent Sterling Dynamics' brand, someone who understands our corporate environment." "I'm not sure that's you." From the security office 3 floors below, Robert Mitchell watched the interview through carefully positioned cameras. Something about the woman in the cheap suit bothered him, though he couldn't quite identify. Her posture was wrong for someone as nervous as she appeared. Her responses to Hayes's questions were too measured, too controlled, and there was something about her eyes, intelligence, that seemed at odds with her humble presentation. Mitchell had been a detective for 12 years before taking the corporate security job, and his instincts were telling him that Maureen Robinson was not what she appeared to be. He made a note to run a more thorough background check, though he suspected he wouldn't find much. People who were this good at hiding usually had resources. Back in Hayes's office, the interview was reaching its predictable conclusion. Hayes had already decided to reject Maureen before she'd walked through the door. This was just theater, a way to justify a decision that had nothing to do with qualifications and everything to do with prejudice. "I think we've covered everything," Hayes said, standing abruptly. "We'll be in touch if we decide to move forward." It was a dismissal wrapped in corporate politeness, and they both knew Maureen would never hear from them again. At least, that's what Hayes believed. As Maureen stood to leave, she caught Hayes in a moment of unguarded triumph. The satisfied smile of someone who'd just put an inappropriate candidate in their place. It was the same expression Maureen had probably worn countless times in her previous life, the casual cruelty of power wielded without thought or consequence. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Maureen allowed herself a small, secret smile. Phase 1 was complete. She'd been underestimated, dismissed, and forgotten, exactly as she'd planned. Now the real work could begin. The Hidden President, Part 3. The interview facade. Maureen had barely reached the elevator when Rebecca's voice called out behind her, tinged with the kind of false urgency that suggested last-minute panic. "Miss Robinson? Could you wait just a moment?" She turned, allowing confusion to play across her features while internally calculating what might have changed. Through the glass walls of the conference room, she could see Jennifer Hayes speaking rapidly into her phone, her body language suggesting she was receiving instructions rather than giving them. "There's been a development," Rebecca said, her earlier smugness replaced by nervous uncertainty. "Ms. Whitman from our legal department would like to observe your formal interview." "It's just a formality," she added quickly, though her tone suggested it was anything but. Maureen nodded meekly, following Rebecca back toward the conference room where Hayes was still on the phone. Through the speaker, she caught fragments of a conversation. "Unusual background. Sarah thinks we should be thorough." "Yes, I understand the important." 20 minutes later, Maureen found herself in Sterling Dynamics' main conference room, facing a panel that had clearly been hastily assembled. Jennifer Hayes sat at the center, flanked by 2 other executives whose nameplates read Michael Chen, Operations Director, and Lisa Park, Finance Manager. At the far end of the table, connected via video conference, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s whose backdrop suggested a high-end law office. "Ms. Robinson," Hayes began, her voice carrying the rehearsed authority of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had clearly escaped her planning. "This is Sarah Whitman, senior partner at Whitman & Associates, our legal counsel. She'll be observing today's interview." Sarah's voice came through the speakers with crystalline clarity. "Thank you for your patience, Miss Robinson. I apologize for the delay, but I wanted to ensure we give your application the thorough consideration it deserves." The phrasing was polite, but Maureen recognized the subtext. Something had triggered additional scrutiny, whether from her earlier responses or some other factor, she wasn't yet sure. "Let's begin with your previous experience," Michael Chen said, consulting a tablet that presumably contained her fabricated resume. "You mentioned administrative work at several companies over the past 8 years. Can you walk us through your responsibilities?" Maureen launched into her prepared narrative, carefully balancing competence with the expected limitations of someone from her supposed background. She spoke of filing systems and phone management, of organizing schedules and handling correspondence, all while maintaining the slightly nervous demeanor of someone intimidated by the corporate environment. "And your technical skill?" Lisa Park asked, her tone suggesting she expected minimal capabilities. "I'm comfortable with basic computer programs," Maureen replied. "Word processing, email, some spreadsheet work. I've had to learn as I go in most of my positions." It was a careful lie. Maureen could build complex financial models that would make these executives' heads spin, had once coded her own algorithmic trading systems, and understood database architecture better than most IT directors. But Robinson, night janitor and aspiring secretary, would have learned Excel from YouTube tutorials and struggled with anything beyond basic formulas. The questioning continued for 30 minutes, covering the expected territory of availability, salary expectations, and why she wanted to work at Sterling Dynamics. Maureen gave the responses they wanted to hear, grateful for the opportunity, willing to start at the bottom, eager to learn from such a prestigious company. But then Michael Chen's expression shifted, and she realized they were moving into more dangerous territory. "Let's talk about the technical aspects of the role," he said, consulting his notes. "Our secretary position requires understanding of corporate communication protocol. If you had to prioritize urgent messages from multiple departments, say, legal, operations and finance, how would you handle competing deadlines?" It was a trap disguised as a competency question. The answer required understanding of corporate hierarchy and decision-making processes that a night janitor wouldn't possess. Maureen felt the familiar thrill of intellectual challenge, the same rush she'd experienced in boardrooms when opponents tried to outmaneuver her. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "I suppose I'd check with my supervisor first," she said carefully, "but if I had to decide myself, I'd probably handle legal issues first, since they often have compliance deadlines, then operations, since that affects day-to-day business, then finance, unless it was specifically marked urgent." The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds too long. Lisa Park's eyebrows rose slightly, and Michael Chen made a note on his tablet. It was exactly the right answer, the answer of someone who understood that legal compliance trumped operational efficiency, which trumped routine financial reporting, unless circumstances demanded otherwise. "That's surprisingly sophisticated reasoning," Jennifer Hayes said, her voice carrying a note of suspicion that hadn't been there before. "I watch a lot of business shows," Maureen replied quickly, allowing embarrassment to color her cheek. "My daughter used to say I should have been born in a boardroom instead of a cleaning supply closet." The mention of her daughter wasn't planned, but it served a dual purpose, humanizing her while explaining away knowledge she shouldn't possess. She watched their faces soften slightly at the personal revelation, the assumption being that she was a working mother trying to better herself through television and wishful thinking. From her law office, Sarah Whitman leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening. "Ms. Robinson, you mentioned competitor analysis in your administrative work. Could you elaborate on what that involved?" Another trap. Maureen's pulse quickened as she realized the interview had shifted from dismissive assessment to active investigation. Sarah Whitman was asking questions that no one would ask a secretary candidate unless they suspected something deeper. "Oh, nothing complicated," Maureen said, forcing a nervous laugh. "One of my previous employers asked me to organize files about other companies in the same industry. I just sorted them by date and marked which ones seemed important." "Basic filing. Really? And how did you determine importance?" Sarah pressed. "Revenue numbers. Mostly, the bigger the company, the more important the file seemed." It was a deliberately naive answer, the kind of surface-level thinking that would be expected from someone with her supposed background. But across town in his Phoenix Industries office, Marcus Thompson was growing increasingly concerned. Maureen's interview was supposed to last 30 minutes. Enough time to be rejected and begin her real work of evaluating Sterling Dynamics. It had been over an hour, and her tracking signal showed she was still in the building. He pulled up the communication protocols they'd established, and sent a coded text, "Running late for lunch. Should I order without you?" The response came back quickly. "Traffic heavier than expected. Order appetizer." Translation: the situation was more complicated than anticipated, but she was maintaining control. Marcus leaned back in his chair, trusting her judgment while preparing contingency plans. 8 years of partnership had taught him that Maureen Robinsons, whatever name she used, was rarely surprised by corporate maneuvering, but something about this felt different. Back in the conference room, the interview was reaching a critical juncture. Sarah Whitman's questions had grown increasingly specific, probing areas that no secretary candidate would be expected to understand. Maureen realized she was walking a tightrope too knowledgeable, and she'd blow her cover too ignorant, and she'd miss the opportunity to assess Sterling Dynamics' true situation. "I think that covers our preliminary questions," Jennifer Hayes said finally, though her tone suggested the preliminaries had revealed more than expected. "We'll need to discuss next steps internally." Sarah Whitman's voice cut through the polite dismissal. "Actually, I'd like Miss Sterling to review this application personally. Ms. Robinson, would you be available to meet with our CEO later today?" The request landed like a bomb in the conference room. Jennifer Hayes's face went pale, clearly recognizing that her authority had just been superseded. Michael Chen and Lisa Park exchanged glances that suggested this was far from routine. "Of course," Maureen stammered, playing the part of someone overwhelmed by unexpected attention from the CEO. "I just need to make arrangements for my other commitment." "Excellent," Sarah said, her smile visible even through the video connection. "Shall we say 3 p.m. in Mr. Sterling's office? Rebecca will provide directions." As the meeting broke up, Maureen gathered her belongings with hands that trembled just enough to be believable. But internally, she was analyzing every nuance of what had just occurred. Someone, Sarah Whitman, most likely had recognized that she wasn't what she appeared to be. The question was, how much did they know, and what did they plan to do about it? The elevator doors closed behind her, and Maureen allowed herself a moment of genuine anticipation. In 6 hours, she would finally come face to face with David Sterling, the man whose company's fate she'd come here to decide. She had a feeling he was going to be far more interesting than his employees suspected. The hours between the panel interview and her appointment with David Sterling stretched like a carefully orchestrated intermission. Maureen spent them in a coffee shop 3 blocks from Sterling Dynamics. Nursing a cup of bitter coffee while reviewing the financial documents Marcus had left in their designated dead drop, a loose brick behind a dumpster in an alley that probably hadn't seen corporate espionage since the Cold War. The numbers told a story that Jennifer Hayes and her colleagues either didn't understand or were deliberately concealing. Sterling Dynamics was hemorrhaging money, their innovative projects stalled by poor management, and their market position eroding daily. They needed Phoenix Industries more than they could possibly know, which meant David Sterling was either a fool or playing a much deeper game than his employees realized. At 2:55 p.m., Maureen stood outside the executive elevator bank, her vinyl purse clutched in hands that she allowed to tremble just enough to maintain her facade. The security guard who escorted her, not Robert Mitchell, she noted, but a younger man whose nameplate read, Johnson, treated her with the polite indifference reserved for people beneath notice. "Mr. Sterling's office is on the 42nd floor, Johnson said as they rode up in silence. "His assistant will take you from here." The executive floor was a monument to corporate power, mahogany paneling, original artwork, the kind of understated luxury that screamed old money and established success. It reminded Maureen painfully of her own executive suite at Phoenix Industries, the one she hadn't seen in 8 years, but which Marcus assured her remained exactly as she'd left it, like a shrine to her former life. David Sterling's assistant was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair, and the bearing of someone who'd gatekept for powerful men longer than Maureen had been alive. Her nameplate read, Margaret Walsh, and her assessment of Maureen was swift and thorough. "Miss Robinson, Mr. Sterling is waiting for you." The office beyond the heavy oak doors was larger than most apartments, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. David Sterling stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, and for a moment, Maureen felt the familiar rush of entering a seat of real power. "Thank you for making time to see me, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of nervous gratitude. "I know how busy you must be." He turned slowly, and the moment their eyes met, Maureen knew her careful charade was over. David Sterling's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally something that might have been admiration. He was older than his photographs suggested, with silver threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of late nights and difficult decisions. But his gaze was sharp, intelligent, and completely focused on her. Maureen Robinsons, he said quietly, her real name falling between them like a dropped gauntlet. The Phoenix herself. I wondered when you'd finally surface. The silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like hours. Maureen could feel the weight of 8 years of carefully constructed identity crashing down around her. But she forced herself to maintain the bewildered expression of someone who had no idea what he was talking about. I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, but I think there's been some mistake. My name is Maureen Robinson, and I'm here about the secretary position. His laugh was rich and genuine, the sound of someone who'd just solved a puzzle that had been bothering him for years. Please, sit down, and drop the act. It's remarkably good, but we both know why you're really here. Sterling moved to his desk and pulled out a leather portfolio, spreading its contents across the polished surface. Maureen recognized them immediately: financial reports, market analyses, and acquisition patterns that pointed directly to Phoenix Industries' hidden activity. I've been tracking your company's movements for 3 years, he said, settling into the chair across from her. Shell companies acquiring strategic positions, mysterious investors appearing at exactly the right moments, competitors suddenly facing unexpected difficulty. The fingerprints were subtle, but they were there. Maureen abandoned her nervous posture, her spine straightening as the mask of humility fell away. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority that had once commanded boardrooms and shaped markets. And yet you allowed me to walk into your building wearing a $12 suit and carrying a fake resume. Either you're more confident than you have any right to be, or you're playing a game I don't understand yet. Both. Sterling leaned back, his expression mixing wariness with genuine respect. I studied your strategies at Wharton, wrote my master's thesis on the Phoenix Industries model. When I realized who you were, I had to make a choice: expose you or see what you really want. And what do you think I want? My company. The question is whether you plan to acquire it or destroy it. The honesty was refreshing after hours of corporate theater. Maureen found herself genuinely curious about this man who'd built Sterling Dynamics from nothing, only to watch it slowly crumble under forces he couldn't control. Your financial reports make interesting reading, she said, neither confirming nor denying his assessment. 17 consecutive quarters of declining revenue, innovation pipelines stalled, market share bleeding to competitors who somehow always seem to know your next move just a little too early. Sterling's jaw tightened. Industrial espionage isn't illegal if you're careful about it. No, but it's expensive, and you're paying for it twice, once to whoever's selling your secrets and again in lost opportunities. Maureen pulled out her own portfolio, the real one she'd compiled over weeks of remote surveillance. Your quantum computing division is 18 months ahead of anyone else in the field, but you're hemorrhaging talent because your board doesn't understand what they have. How could you possibly know that? Because 3 of your best engineers now work for companies that Phoenix Industries has strategic partnerships with. They were recruited specifically to share what they learned here. It was a calculated admission, designed to demonstrate her reach while revealing Sterling Dynamics' vulnerabilities. Sterling stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him processing the implication. You're telling me that you've been systematically dismantling my company for months, and now you're sitting in my office explaining how you did it. I'm telling you that your company has been dismantling itself for years. I've simply been observing the process. While deciding whether anything was worth saving, the admission hung in the air between them, brutal in its honesty. Sterling pushed back from his desk and walked to the windows, his reflection ghost-like against the cityscape. And what have you decided? Maureen studied his profile, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched behind his back. 8 years ago she would have already made her decision based purely on numbers and strategic advantage. But 8 years of living among people who worked for survival rather than profit had changed her perspective in ways she was still discovering. That depends, she said finally, on whether you're the kind of CEO who lets HR directors humiliate job candidates for sport, or if Jennifer Hayes represents a problem you haven't had time to address. Sterling turned back to her, surprise evident in his expression. You're evaluating my company's culture? I'm evaluating everything: financial health, strategic position, leadership competence, organizational toxicity. Phoenix Industries doesn't acquire damaged goods, Mr. Sterling. We either fix them or destroy them. And which? Maureen stood, gathering her papers with movements that were now fluid and confident, every trace of nervous supplicant erased. That remains to be seen, but I'll need complete access to your operations to make that determination. You're asking me to let you conduct corporate espionage from inside my own building. I'm asking you to choose between controlled evaluation and hostile takeover. Because make no mistake, those are your only options. Sterling was quiet for a long moment, weighing decisions that would determine his company's fate. Finally he nodded slowly. How long do you need? 72 hours. And if I refuse? Maureen's smile was sharp as winter steel. Then you'll discover exactly how thorough Phoenix Industries can be when we stop being subtle. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. There are other parties investigating my presence here. If you want to keep this arrangement quiet, you'll need to manage them carefully. Sarah Whitman, among others. Your head of security is also asking uncomfortable questions. Sterling nodded grimly. I'll handle it. As Maureen reached for the door handle, he called her name one final time. The woman who came in here an hour ago, the night janitor looking for work, was she real at all? Maureen paused, her hand on the polished brass. She's the reason I'm here, Mr. Sterling. 8 years ago I forgot what it cost to build an empire. That woman reminds me every day. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving David Sterling alone with the weight of a decision that would reshape both their futures. David Sterling stood motionless at his office window for 10 minutes after Maureen left, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a vast circuit board. The weight of her ultimatum pressed against his chest. 72 hours to prove his company deserved to survive. He'd built Sterling Dynamics from a garage startup to a multi-billion-dollar corporation, but he'd never faced an adversary who could dismantle it with the casual efficiency of someone solving a crossword puzzle. His intercom buzzed. Mr. Sterling. Sarah Whitman is online too. She says it's urgent. Sterling closed his eyes briefly, then picked up the phone. Sarah. David. We need to talk. That woman you just met with. There's something very wrong about her background. I've been digging since this morning, and none of her employment history checks out. The companies she claims to have worked for either don't exist, or have no record of her. Sterling kept his voice carefully neutral, acutely aware that this conversation would determine whether he could honor his agreement with Maureen or if external forces would make the decision for him. There's more. I've been tracking some unusual corporate activity lately. Shell companies, strategic acquisitions, patterns that suggest someone's been positioning for a major move. This woman appearing now with her fabricated background. It's not a coincidence. Sterling moved to his desk, pulling out a legal pad and writing a single word. Phoenix. He stared at it for a moment, then covered it with his hand. What do you recommend? Full investigation. I want to know who she really is, who she works for, and what she's really doing here. Robert Mitchell in security has already flagged some inconsistencies in her behavior. Give me 24 hours and I'll have answers. No, the word came out sharper than Sterling intended. Sarah's silence stretched uncomfortably before she responded. David, I understand you want to handle this delicately, but if we're looking at industrial espionage, I said no, Sarah. Drop the investigation. I can't do that. Not when the company's security might be compromised. Sterling closed his eyes, recognizing the impossible position Maureen had placed him in. Loyal employees doing their jobs would inevitably collide with the dangerous game he'd agreed to play. 24 hours, he said finally. Give me 24 hours to handle this internally before you take any formal action. 3 floors below, Robert Mitchell was conducting his own investigation with the methodical patience of a former detective. Maureen Robinson's background was a masterpiece of misdirection, enough legitimate traces to pass casual scrutiny, but full of gaps and inconsistencies that became obvious under professional examination. The woman, who claimed to have worked as a night janitor for the past 8 years, had no social media presence, no credit history extending back more than a decade, and employment records that existed in company databases but referenced facilities that had been demolished or restructured. Either she was in witness protection, or someone with serious resources had spent considerable effort crafting her identity. Mitchell pulled up the security footage from her morning arrival, studying her movements frame by frame. Her body language was wrong for someone genuinely nervous about a job interview. She moved through the lobby with the unconscious confidence of someone familiar with corporate environments, her eyes scanning for security cameras with the awareness of someone who understood surveillance systems. But it was the elevator footage that clinched his suspicions. For exactly 3 seconds, while the elevator climbed toward the executive floor, her mask had slipped, her posture straightened, her expression shifted from nervous supplicant to something that looked distinctly predatory, and she'd checked her reflection in the polished steel doors with the kind of tactical assessment he'd seen in Undercover Operative. Mitchell reached for his phone to call Sarah Whitman, then hesitated. Sterling's instruction to handle the situation internally suggested there was more to this than met the eye. And if Robert Mitchell had learned anything in his years of police work, it was that powerful people often had compelling reasons for their apparently irrational decisions. Meanwhile, Maureen had returned to her modest apartment to conduct her own investigation into Sterling Dynamics' internal structure. The financial reports Marcus had provided were just the beginning. She needed to understand the human dynamics that would determine whether the company could be salvaged or if it was better off being absorbed into Phoenix Industries' portfolio. Her laptop, far more sophisticated than anything Maureen Robinson, night janitor, should have owned, connected to networks that officially didn't exist. Within an hour, she had access to Sterling Dynamics' internal communications, personnel files, and operational data that painted a picture of a company struggling with more than just financial problems. Jennifer Hayes's email history was particularly illuminating. Her treatment of Maureen wasn't an aberration. It was part of a pattern of harassment and discrimination that extended to multiple employees. Worse, her incompetence was costing the company talented people who couldn't tolerate her management style. The quantum computing division that Sterling had mentioned was bleeding personnel at an alarming rate, not because of industrial espionage, but because Hayes had systematically undermined the department head, Rachel Kim, in an apparent attempt to position herself for a promotion she wasn't qualified for. Maureen's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus: "Package inspection complete. Contents as expected, but wrapper shows signs of tampering." Translation: he'd completed his analysis of Sterling Dynamics' public financial data, and while the numbers matched her expectations, there were signs that someone else was also investigating the company's vulnerabilities. She responded quickly: "Continue monitoring, may need alternative packaging soon." As evening fell, the various threads of investigation began to converge in ways that none of the participants had anticipated. Sarah Whitman's legal research had uncovered connections between recent corporate acquisitions and a pattern of companies that had been quietly absorbed by larger entities after periods of apparent instability. Robert Mitchell's security analysis had identified at least 3 other instances in the past year where individuals with fabricated backgrounds had appeared in Sterling Dynamics' vicinity during critical business periods, suggesting that Maureen's presence was part of a large coordinated effort. And in her apartment, Maureen was discovering that Sterling Dynamics' problems went deeper than poor management. Someone was actively sabotaging the company from within, feeding information to competitors and creating the very vulnerabilities that had made it an attractive target for acquisition. The question was whether David Sterling was aware of the sabotage or if he was as much a victim as she'd initially assumed. Her investigation was interrupted by an unexpected knock at her apartment door. Through the peephole, she saw Jennifer Hayes standing in the hallway, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like desperation. Maureen opened the door carefully, maintaining her humble facade while calculating the implications of this unscheduled visit. "Ms. Robinson," Hayes said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "I need to talk to you about your interview today. There's been a misunderstanding, The word carried layers of meaning, none of them good. Someone had connected dots that weren't supposed to be connected, or Hayes had discovered something that threatened both their carefully constructed realities. "I'm not sure what you mean," Maureen replied, stepping aside to let Hayes enter while mentally cataloging potential exit strategy. Hayes moved into the small apartment, her eyes taking in details that didn't quite fit: the laptop on the kitchen table, the quality of Maureen's furniture, the subtle signs of someone with resources living deliberately below their means. "You're not who you claim to be," Hayes said bluntly. "And I think you know exactly why that's a problem for both of us." Maureen closed the door softly, recognizing that her 72-hour timeline had just become significantly more complicated. Jennifer Hayes knew something, whether through her own investigation or because someone else had shared information, and her presence here suggested that the careful balance Sterling had tried to maintain was about to collapse. "What exactly do you think you know, Ms. Hayes?" Hayes turned to face her, and Maureen saw something she hadn't expected. Fear, not the petty insecurity that had driven Hayes's earlier cruelty, but genuine terror of someone who'd realized she was caught in something much larger and more dangerous than she'd understood. "I know that people are asking questions about you," Hayes said quietly, "and I know that when powerful people start asking questions about someone like me, it usually doesn't end well." The admission hung between them, revealing the true nature of Hayes's visit. She wasn't here to expose Maureen. She was here to negotiate her own survival in a game she'd only just realized she was playing. Outside, Marcus Thompson sat in his car 3 blocks away, monitoring communication frequencies and preparing contingency plans. His employer had always been careful, but something about this operation felt different. The variables were multiplying faster than they could be controlled, and too many people were asking the right questions. His phone buzzed with an emergency code he hadn't seen in 8 years. Maureen was requesting immediate extraction, but as he started the engine, Marcus realized that extraction might no longer be possible. The web they'd so carefully constructed around Sterling Dynamics was beginning to entangle them as well. Jennifer Hayes stood in Maureen's modest apartment like a deer caught in headlights, her earlier corporate arrogance replaced by raw vulnerability. The designer clothes that had seemed like armor during the interview now looked like a costume, emphasizing how far she was from the safety of her executive floor. "Please," Hayes said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know what I've stumbled into before it destroys me." Maureen gestured to the worn couch, studying Hayes with new interest. The woman's fear was genuine, but fear could make people dangerous in unpredictable ways. "Why don't you start by telling me what you think you know?" Hayes perched on the edge of the cushion, her hands trembling as she pulled out her phone. "After our interview, I couldn't stop thinking about your answers. They were too sophisticated for someone with your background. So I did some checking." She scrolled through her phone, showing Maureen a series of screenshots. "Your employment history, half the companies don't exist anymore, and the ones that do have no record of you. Your social security number traces back to a woman who died in and your address. This apartment has been rented under 6 different names in the past 8 years. Maureen kept her expression neutral while internally calculating how much Hayes had discovered and who else might have access to the same information. "That's quite thorough research for an HR director." "I have friends in places you wouldn't expect," Hayes said bitterly. "When you grow up rich and useless, you learn to leverage other people's skills to stay relevant." She looked up, meeting Maureen's eyes for the first time. "But that's not what scares me." "What?" 2 hours ago, Sarah Whitman called me. She wanted to know if I'd noticed anything unusual about your interview, if you'd said anything that seemed rehearsed or out of place. She's building a file on you, and she specifically asked about my questioning technique. Maureen leaned back, processing the implications. Sarah Whitman was methodical, which meant she was collecting evidence for a purpose. The question was whether she was building a case for criminal prosecution or corporate espionage charge. "There's more," Hayes continued, her voice growing shakier. "Robert Mitchell from security accessed my email history this afternoon. He was looking at the questions I asked you, the notes I made during the interview." "Why would security care about a secretary candidate unless what? Unless you're not really here for a secretary position?" Hayes's laugh was bitter and self-aware. God, I've been such an idiot. I treated you like garbage because I thought you were beneath me, when you're probably the most dangerous person who's ever walked into that building. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Maureen found herself feeling an unexpected sympathy for this young woman who'd built her identity on privilege and superiority, only to discover she was a pawn in a game she couldn't comprehend. Jennifer, Maureen said gently, using her first name for the first time. What do you want from me? I want to know if I'm going to survive this, Hayes said simply. Because whatever's happening here, whatever you're really doing, I'm starting to think I'm collateral damage. Before Maureen could respond, her secure phone buzzed with another message from Marcus. Traffic getting heavy. Alternate routes recommended. Multiple parties were now actively investigating, and the situation was deteriorating faster than she'd anticipated. But looking at Hayes genuinely frightened, stripped of pretense for perhaps the first time in her adult life, Maureen made a decision that surprised herself. Jennifer, how badly do you want to keep your job? Hayes blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What do you mean? If you could start over somewhere else, with better references than you deserve and opportunities you haven't earned, would you take that chance? Yes. Of course, but why would you? Because you're right about being collateral damage, and because giving you a chance to disappear might be the kindest thing anyone's done for you in years. Across town, Robert Mitchell was experiencing his own crisis of conscience. His investigation had uncovered enough evidence to justify calling the FBI, multiple identity fraud charges, suspected corporate espionage, possible industrial sabotage. But something about David Sterling's behavior suggested there was more to the story. Mitchell had worked for Sterling for 3 years, and he'd never seen the CEO protect someone who posed a genuine threat to the company. Sterling was shrewd, sometimes ruthless, but never reckless. If he was sheltering Maureen Robinson, he had reasons that went beyond what Mitchell could see. The security director found himself staring at his computer screen, cursor hovering over Sarah Whitman's contact information. One phone call would set in motion an investigation that would expose whatever game was being played. But it would also end David Sterling's career, and possibly destroy the company that employed 3,000 people. Mitchell's military training had taught him to follow orders and trust his commanding officer. His police experience had taught him that powerful people often had compelling reasons for apparently inexplicable decisions. The question was which lesson applied here. His phone rang, interrupting his internal debate. Mitchell? Robert? It's David. I need to see you in my office immediately, and bring everything you've compiled on our morning visitor. 20 minutes later, Mitchell sat across from Sterling's desk, watching his boss review the security file with the focused intensity of someone making a life-or-death decision. This is thorough work, Sterling said finally. Professional-grade investigation. How much of this have you shared? Nothing yet. But Sarah Whitman's been asking questions, and I think she suspects more than she's saying. Sterling nodded slowly. Robert, I'm going to ask you to do something that goes against every instinct you have as a security professional. Sir, I need you to lose this file. All of it. The video footage, the background checks, the analysis. Make it disappear. Mitchell stared at his boss, recognizing the magnitude of what was being asked. Mr. Sterling, if this woman is who I think she might be, she could destroy this company. Yes, Sterling said quietly. She could, but she could also save it. And right now, salvation matters more than security. It was a leap of faith that could end both their careers. But something in Sterling's voice convinced Mitchell that his boss understood the stakes better than he did. What about Whitney? I'll handle Sarah, but I need to know that you're with me on this. Mitchell thought about the 3,000 employees who depended on Sterling Dynamics for their livelihood, about the innovative projects that could change the world if given the chance to develop, about the choice between calculated risk and certain destruction. The file never existed, he said finally. Back in her apartment, Maureen was explaining to Jennifer Hayes why disappearing might be her best option for survival when her secure phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in 8 years, David Sterling's private line. We have a problem, Sterling said without preamble. Sarah Whitman is building a federal case. She's contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division and requested a preliminary investigation into corporate espionage. Maureen closed her eyes, feeling the careful structure she'd built around this operation beginning to crumble. Timeline: 24 hours, maybe less. She's convinced that you're advance reconnaissance for a hostile takeover, and she has enough evidence to make that case stick. Then we accelerate the schedule, Maureen said, her mind already shifting to contingency plans. I'll need complete access to your executive systems tonight. That's impossible. Security protocols, Miss Sterling, Maureen interrupted, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded a corporate empire. In 24 hours, your company will either be under federal investigation or under my protection. Choose wisely. The line went quiet for a moment before Sterling responded. Midnight executive floor. And pray that we're both making the right decision. As Maureen hung up, she realized that Jennifer Hayes had heard enough of the conversation to understand that whatever was happening was reaching its climax. The young woman sat frozen on the couch, finally comprehending the true scale of the forces she'd accidentally wandered into. You're really going to destroy Sterling Dynamics, aren't you? Hayes whispered. Maureen looked at her. This privileged, cruel, frightened young woman, who represented everything wrong with corporate culture, and made a decision that would have surprised the person she'd been 8 years ago. No, she said quietly. I'm going to save. The question is whether it deserves to be saved. And for the first time since her daughter's death, Maureen Robinsons began to believe that redemption might be possible for institutions as well as individuals. The Sterling Dynamics building at midnight felt like a mausoleum, its normally bustling corridors empty except for the skeletal night security crew. Maureen moved through the executive floor with the confidence of someone who belonged there, her earlier disguise abandoned in favor of the dark business attire that better suited her true purpose. David Sterling had provided her with executive access codes, a leap of faith that would either save his company or destroy them both. She was deep in the financial systems, tracing the patterns of sabotage she'd identified earlier, when the elevator chimed softly in the distance. Sterling wasn't supposed to meet her until 2 a.m., and the security guards weren't scheduled for this floor until dawn. Maureen's fingers flew across the keyboard, copying critical files while her mind calculated escape route. The footsteps in the hallway were measured, confident, not the uncertain shuffle of a security guard, but the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Maureen slipped into the adjoining conference room just as the footsteps stopped outside Sterling's office. Through the glass partition, she watched a man in an expensive overcoat use his own keycard to enter Sterling's office. Even in the dim light, she recognized him immediately. Thomas Green, her former business partner and co-founder of Phoenix Industries, the man she'd left behind 8 years ago without explanation or goodbye. Thomas moved through Sterling's office with the efficiency of someone conducting a search, photographing documents with a high-end camera and copying files to a portable drive. His presence here could only mean one thing. Phoenix Industries was under threat, and he'd traced that threat to Sterling Dynamics. Maureen's secure phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Perimeter compromised, unknown vehicle in executive parking. Suggest immediate withdrawal, but withdrawal was no longer possible. Thomas's investigation would eventually lead him to her, and when it did, 8 years of carefully constructed anonymity would evaporate. Worse, his presence meant that Phoenix Industries' board of directors, the people who believed she was dead, had finally grown suspicious of the mysterious proxy votes and strategic decisions that had guided the company in her absence. She made a decision that violated every principle of operational security she'd learned. Opening the conference room door, she stepped into Sterling's office. "Hello, Thomas." Thomas Green spun around, his camera clattering to the floor. For a moment, his face cycled through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been relief before settling into cold fury. "Maureen Robinsons," he said quietly, "the ghost who's been haunting my company for 8 years. Your company." Maureen kept her voice level, though her heart was racing. "I seem to remember founding Phoenix Industries together. You remember founding it, I remember you abandoning it when Emma died. leaving me to explain to investors and employees why our visionary leader had simply vanished. Thomas's voice carried 8 years of accumulated anger and hurt. Do you have any idea what it's been like? Trying to run a company while pretending its real leader wasn't dead or missing. I'm sorry, Maureen said, and meant, in her guilt and grief, she'd never considered the position she'd put Thomas in, the impossible burden of maintaining her legacy while building his own leadership. Sorry. Thomas laughed bitterly. You've been manipulating Phoenix Industries from the shadows, making strategic decisions through proxy votes and shell companies, undermining my authority at every turn. And now I find you here, in the office of a CEO whose company we've been systematically weakening for acquisition. What exactly are you sorry for? Before Maureen could answer, David Sterling's voice cut through the tension from the doorway. I believe that would be my question to ask, Sterling said, entering his office with Robert Mitchell close behind. Since this is still technically my build, the four of them stood in an awkward tableau, each representing different aspects of the corporate drama that had been building for months. Sterling's expression was carefully neutral, but Maureen could see the calculation in his eyes as he processed the implications of Thomas's presence. David Sterling, Thomas said, extending his hand with practiced corporate courtesy. Thomas Green, Phoenix Industries, I believe we have mutual interest to discuss. Such as the woman who's been playing all of us for the past 8 years. Thomas's smile was sharp as a blade. Did you know that your mysterious consultant is actually the founding president of Phoenix Industries, the same Phoenix Industries that's been positioning for a hostile takeover of your company? Sterling's poker face was admirable, but Maureen caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested Thomas's revelation wasn't entirely unexpected. I'm aware of Miss Robinson's background, Sterling said carefully. Are you aware that she's been dead in all but name for 8 years? That Phoenix Industries board believes she died in the same accident that killed her daughter. Thomas pulled out his phone, showing them a news article from 8 years ago. Official story, car accident, bodies unrecoverable. Unofficial reality, she disappeared and left me to build a corporate empire on the foundation of a lie. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Maureen realized that Thomas's anger went deeper than professional betrayal. He'd spent 8 years grieving a partner he'd believed was dead, only to discover she'd been alive and secretly manipulating everything he'd worked to build. The board is meeting tomorrow, Thomas continued, his voice deadly quiet. They're planning to vote on dissolving Phoenix Industries and selling its assets. Do you know? Because they've discovered that our strategic decisions for the past 8 years have been based on intelligence from someone who officially doesn't exist. Maureen felt the carefully constructed world she'd built collapsing around her. Thomas, I can explain. Explain what? That you've been committing corporate fraud on a massive scale, that every decision Phoenix Industries has made since your death is legally questionable because it was influenced by someone with no official standing. Thomas's laugh was bitter. The FBI is already investigating. They'll be here within hours. Sterling moved to his desk, his expression grim. Then we have a problem that goes beyond corporate rivalry. Thomas turned his attention back to Sterling. There is no we. Your company is finished, Sterling. Phoenix Industries board will sell our assets to pay legal fees, and those assets include enough market intelligence to destroy Sterling Dynamics completely. Unless, Maureen said quietly, we find a third option. Both men stared at her, and she realized that for the first time in 8 years, she was thinking not as a shadow manipulator but as the leader she'd once been. The strategic mind that had built Phoenix Industries from nothing was finally reasserting itself, not to hide or destroy but to create something new. What kind of third option? Sterling asked. The kind that saves both companies and gives the FBI something more interesting to investigate than corporate espionage. Maureen moved to Sterling's whiteboard, her mind already mapping possibilities. Thomas, you said the board is meeting tomorrow to dissolve Phoenix Industries. That's right. And Sterling, how much debt is your company carrying? Enough to justify acquisition, Sterling admitted. Then we don't fight each other, Maureen said, turning to face them both. We merge. Phoenix Industries doesn't dissolve, it acquires Sterling Dynamics in a legitimate business transaction. Thomas gets to maintain his leadership while gaining access to Sterling's innovation pipeline. David gets the capital infusion he needs, while retaining operational control of his division. And what do you get? Thomas asked suspiciously. Maureen looked at the two men who represented her past and her potential future, thinking of Emma's photo in her wallet, and the 8 years she'd spent learning what it meant to build something meaningful rather than just profitable. I get to come back from the dead properly, she said, as a partner, not a puppet master. The silence stretched for long moments before Sterling spoke. The FBI will find a complex but legitimate merger instead of corporate espionage. Maureen finished. Assuming we can pull this off in the next 6 hours. Thomas stared at her, and she could see him weighing 8 years of anger against the possibility of salvaging everything they'd both worked for. 6 hours to restructure two major corporations and present it as a planned merger rather than a hostile takeover, he said finally. 6 hours to save everything we've built, Maureen corrected. All of us. Outside, Marcus Thompson watched from his car as federal agents took positions around the Sterling Dynamics building. The FBI had arrived ahead of schedule, which meant someone had accelerated their timeline. His phone. Marcus, we're going to need that umbrella after all, Maureen's voice said. But not for extraction, for coverage while we work. Marcus smiled grimly, understanding immediately. After 8 years of hiding, Maureen Robinsons was finally ready to step back into the light. The only question was whether she could pull off the most audacious corporate maneuver of her career before the federal agents decided to end the game permanently. The fluorescent lights of Sterling Dynamics' executive conference room hummed with the tension of 3 corporate leaders trying to restructure 2 companies before dawn. Maureen had commandeered the whiteboard, mapping merger scenarios with the focused intensity that had once made her legendary in boardrooms across the world. Thomas and Sterling sat across from each other, their mutual distrust temporarily set aside in favor of survival. The debt structure won't work, Thomas said, reviewing Sterling's financial projections. Phoenix Industries' liquidity position can absorb the acquisition, but your innovation division is hemorrhaging talent faster than we can replace them. Because someone's been systematically recruiting them, Sterling replied, shooting a pointed look at Maureen. Because Jennifer Hayes has been systematically driving them away, Maureen corrected, not looking up from her calculations. Your quantum computing team has lost 6 senior engineers in the past year. Only 2 were recruited externally. The other 4 simply quit. She turned to face them, marker still in hand. Which brings us to the cultural integration problem. Phoenix Industries succeeds because we value innovation over hierarchy. Sterling Dynamics is failing because middle management is strangling innovation with bureaucracy and prejudice. You want to gut my management structure, Sterling said. I want to save your company, Maureen replied. Sometimes that requires the same thing. Their planning was interrupted by Robert Mitchell's urgent knock. He entered without waiting for permission, his expression grim. We have a problem. Sarah Whitman just arrived with 2 FBI agents. They're demanding access to executive floors and all files related to the Phoenix Industries investigation. Sterling checked his watch. 4:17 a.m. They're early. There's more. Mitchell continued. Someone leaked the story to the financial press. The Wall Street Journal is running a piece in 2 hours about mysterious Phoenix Industries activities and potential corporate espionage at Sterling Dynamics. Thomas swore quietly. The board will see that article and accelerate the dissolution vote. We'll be lucky if Phoenix Industries exists by close of business today. Maureen set down her marker, her mind shifting from merger planning to crisis management. 8 years of hiding had ended, but she could still control how the revelation unfolded. Robert, how long can you delay the FBI's access? Maybe 30 minutes. They have warrants, but they're not familiar with the building's security protocols. Thomas, can you conference in the Phoenix Industries board? At 4 in the morning. They're about to vote on dissolving a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I think they'll take the call. Sterling stood, understanding dawning in his expression. You're going to reveal yourself to them direct. I'm going to prevent them from making the biggest mistake in corporate history. Maureen corrected. But we need to move fast. 20 minutes later, the conference room screen displayed 9 faces of Phoenix Industries board members in various states of early morning dishevelment. Thomas had sold the emergency meeting as a final attempt to save the company, but none of them were prepared for what they were about to witness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice carrying the weight of 8 years of deception. "I'd like you to meet someone." Maureen stepped into the camera's view, and the silence that followed was deafening. Board member Catherine Walsh spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's impossible. Maureen Robinsons died 8 years ago." "No," Maureen said simply. "Maureen Robinsons disappeared 8 years ago." "There's a difference." The questions came in a flood. Where had she been? Why had she hidden? How had she been influencing company decisions? But Maureen raised her hand for silence. "I don't have time for a full explanation. In 15 minutes, FBI agents will enter this building looking for evidence of corporate espionage. In 2 hours, the Wall Street Journal will publish a story that could destroy both Phoenix Industries and Sterling Dynamics. You have one chance to save everything we built together." Board member Richard Chen leaned forward. "What do you propose?" "Legitimate merger. Phoenix Industries acquires Sterling Dynamics in a transparent business transaction. Thomas remains CEO, David Sterling becomes Chief Innovation Officer, and I return as Chief Strategic Officer. The FBI investigation becomes irrelevant because there's no espionage, just a complex but legal corporate restructuring." "And why should we trust you after 8 years of lies?" Catherine Walsh's voice carried decades of boardroom skepticism. Maureen pulled out her phone, displaying Emma's photograph to the camera. "Because 8 years ago I chose work over my daughter's life, and she died because of that choice. I've spent every day since then learning what it means to value people over profit. Phoenix Industries succeeded in my absence because you continued that philosophy. Sterling Dynamics is failing because they forgot it." She gestured to the whiteboard behind her, covered with merger projections and cultural integration plans. "This isn't about my redemption or ego. This is about creating a company that innovates without sacrificing humanity, that succeeds without destroying the people who make success possible." Thomas stepped forward. "The board needs to vote now. FBI agents are already in the building." The vote was swift. 6 in favor, 3 abstaining. Phoenix Industries would acquire Sterling Dynamics, effective immediately. As the board meeting ended, Sarah Whitman's voice echoed from the hallway, directing FBI agents toward the executive conference room. Maureen straightened her shoulders, preparing to face the consequences of 8 years of carefully constructed deception. The conference room door opened, and Sarah Whitman entered with 2 federal agents, whose expressions suggested they'd been expecting to find evidence of criminal activity, not a legitimate business meeting. "Ms. Whitman," Sterling said calmly. "Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet our new strategic partner." Sarah's eyes went straight to Maureen, recognition dawning slowly. "You're Maureen Robinsons, the Phoenix Industries founder who supposedly died 8 years ago." "Very much alive," Maureen replied, "and very much looking forward to explaining how Phoenix Industries' acquisition of Sterling Dynamics will benefit both companies' shareholders." One of the FBI agents stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning regarding suspected corporate espionage activities." "Of course," Maureen said. "But you might want to review the merger documents first. You'll find that what appeared to be espionage was actually due diligence for a legitimate acquisition that was just approved by Phoenix Industries' board of directors." The lead agent took the documents Thomas handed him, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as he reviewed the timestamps and signatures. "These documents are dated this morning, effective immediately." Sterling all previous Phoenix Industries activities regarding Sterling Dynamics were part of acquisition planning, not espionage. It was a masterful piece of legal misdirection, technically true, utterly misleading, and completely impossible to prosecute. The FBI agents found themselves investigating a crime that had retroactively become legal business practice. As dawn broke over the city, Maureen stood at Sterling's office windows, watching the FBI agents leave with boxes of documents, that would reveal nothing more criminal than aggressive corporate strategy. Thomas and Sterling flanked her, the three of them exhausted but oddly exhilarated. "So what happens now?" Sterling asked. "Now we build something better," Maureen said, "starting with fixing the cultural problems that nearly destroyed your company." Jennifer Hayes, Thomas asked. "Jennifer Hayes gets a choice," Maureen replied, thinking of the terrified young woman who'd sat in her apartment 12 hours earlier. "Redemption or termination." "Same choice I'm giving everyone else," Sterling smiled. "Including Maureen touched the window glass, feeling the warmth of sunlight for the first time in 8 years without the weight of secrets pressing down on her shoulders. "Especially myself," she said. "It's time to stop hiding and start building." Below them, the city was waking up to news of the Phoenix-Sterling merger. A story of corporate resurrection that no one yet understood was really about the resurrection of Maureen Robinsons herself. 3 weeks after the merger announcement sent shockwaves through the business world, Maureen sat in what had once been David Sterling's office, now serving as the temporary headquarters for the most complex corporate integration in recent memory. The Wall Street Journal had dubbed it the Phoenix Rising merger, though they had no idea how literally accurate that headline was. The morning brought Marcus Thompson to her door, carrying coffee and the expression of someone who'd spent 8 years worrying about his friend's well-being. "The board wants your decision by noon," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. CEO of the merged entity, or Chief Strategic Officer reporting to Tom. Maureen accepted the coffee, real cream now, a small luxury she was still adjusting to, and gestured toward the stack of personnel files covering her desk. "I've been reading about our employees, all 27,000 of them, having second thoughts about the merge, having second thoughts about everything." Maureen opened one of the files, showing Marcus the photograph of a young engineer named David Kim, not related to Dr. Rachel Kim, despite the name. "This is David Kim, quantum computing specialist, 26 years old, brilliant mind, graduated from MIT with the kind of grades that should have guaranteed him a meteoric career." Marcus studied the file. "Sterling Dynamics employee. He quit 6 months ago after Jennifer Hayes blocked his promotion 3 times. Citing cultural fit concerns, he's now working at a tech startup in Austin, making half what he's worth because he couldn't stand the environment here." She pulled out another file. "Maria Santos, 43, operations manager, 15 years with the company, perfect performance reviews, until Hayes decided she was too emotional for executive leadership. She's been passed over for promotion 7 times in 3 years. And your point is?" "My point is that Jennifer Hayes wasn't just cruel to me, she was systematically destroying the careers of anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of corporate acceptability. Young engineers, older women, anyone from a working-class background." Maureen closed the files with deliberate care. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Before Marcus could answer, Rebecca Chen knocked on the door. The young receptionist had undergone a remarkable transformation over the past 3 weeks. Gone were the condescending smiles and dismissive attitudes, replaced by something approaching genuine professionalism. "Robinsons, Jennifer Hayes is here for her appointment." Maureen checked her watch. The meeting she'd been dreading was finally here. "Send her in." Jennifer Hayes entered the office like someone walking to her own execution, her earlier arrogance replaced by barely contained terror. She'd spent 3 weeks in administrative limbo, knowing that her treatment of Maureen during the interview process had become the subject of corporate legend and not the kind that enhanced career prospects. "Please, sit," Maureen said, her voice carefully neutral. Hayes perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "I know why I'm here. Do you? You're going to fire me, and you have every right to. The way I treated you was inexcusable." Maureen leaned back, studying the young woman who had embodied everything wrong with Sterling Dynamics' corporate culture. "Tell me about David Kim." Hayes blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "The engineer? He had attitude problems. Such as?" "He questioned my decision." Went over my head to Dr. Rachel Kim when I told him his project proposals weren't viable. Were they viable? Hayes's silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, she admitted. I don't know. I don't have the technical background to evaluate quantum computing research. But you blocked his promotions anyway. I was told that maintaining hierarchical respect was important for department morale. Who told you that? Another silence, longer this time. I told myself that, because admitting I was wrong would have meant acknowledging that a 26-year-old kid understood the business better than I did. It was the first honest thing Jennifer Hayes had said in any of their interactions, and Maureen found herself reassessing the young woman sitting across from her. Cruelty born from insecurity was still cruelty, but it might be correctable in ways that cruelty born from genuine malice was not. Jennifer, what do you know about second chances? Hayes looked up, confusion evident in her expression. I'm not sure what you mean. 8 years ago I made choices that cost my daughter her life. I've spent every day since then trying to figure out how to be worthy of a second chance. Maureen pulled Emma's photograph from her desk drawer, setting it where Hayes could see it. The question is, what would you do with a second chance if someone offered it to you? I don't understand. David Kim, Maria Santos, all the people whose careers you damaged because you were too insecure to admit you didn't know everything. If I gave you the authority to fix those mistakes, would you? Hayes stared at the photograph, and Maureen could see her processing the implications. You're not firing me? I'm offering you a choice. You can resign with a reasonable severance package and positive references that will help you find another position somewhere else. Or you can stay and spend the next year personally reaching out to every person your decisions hurt, offering them positions with Phoenix Sterling that match their actual abilities. That's dozens of people. 87 people. To be exact. I've had the HR department compile a complete list. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through disbelief, calculation, and something that might have been hope. Why would you do this, after everything I put you through? Because someone once told me that the measure of a person isn't the mistakes they make, but what they do to fix them. Maureen thought of Elena on the subway, the cleaning woman who'd recognized intelligence beneath humble appearance. And because I believe people can change if they're given compelling reasons to do so, what would my role be? If I stayed, Director of Employee Advocacy, you'd report directly to me, and your job would be ensuring that no one else experiences what you put David Kim and Maria Santos through. It's not a punishment. It's a chance to use your understanding of systemic prejudice to dismantle it. Hayes stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The board will never accept it. The other executives will see it as weakness. The board will accept whatever I recommend. And the other executives need to understand that our new corporate culture values redemption over retribution. And if I can't do it, if I fail at being the person you think I could become. Maureen smiled, thinking of her own journey from ruthless corporate leader to night janitor, whatever she was becoming now. Then you'll have failed while trying to be better than you were. That's more than most people can say. The intercom buzzed, and Rebecca's voice announced that Thomas Green had arrived for the executive strategy meeting. Hayes turned from the window, her decision evident in her posture. I'll take the position, she said quietly, and I'll start with David Kim. After Hayes left, Thomas entered with David Sterling and Dr. Rachel Kim, whose quantum computing team had become the crown jewel of the merger. The afternoon would be spent finalizing the leadership structure that would guide Phoenix Sterling into its uncertain future. So Thomas said, settling into his chair with the easy confidence of someone who'd finally been relieved of 8 years of impossible burdens. CEO or strategic advisor. Maureen looked around the room at the faces of people who'd chosen to trust her despite her deceptions, who'd built something worth saving despite institutional obstacles, who'd believed that corporations could be forces for good rather than just profit. CEO, she said simply. But not the kind I was before, Sterling smiled. What kind then? Maureen picked up Emma's photograph, holding it carefully. The kind my daughter would have been proud of. Outside, Marcus Thompson finished his final security sweep of the building, satisfied that the various threats that had circled around Maureen for weeks had finally dissipated. Phoenix Sterling was safe, its employees were protected, and his friend had finally stepped back into the light where she belonged. His phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number. Package delivered safely. New address confirmed. Umbrella, no longer needed. Marcus smiled, deleting the message. After 8 years of shadows and secrets, Maureen Robinsons was finally home. 3 months later, Maureen stood in the lobby of Phoenix Sterling headquarters, watching David Kim explain quantum computing concepts to a group of visiting students. The young engineer had returned from Austin with a promotion and a research budget that would have been unimaginable under the old regime. Rebecca Chen, now Director of Human Resources, approached with her morning brief. Maria Santos wants to thank you personally for her promotion to Vice President of Operations. And Jennifer completed her 87th call yesterday. David Kim was the last one. Maureen smiled. Jennifer Hayes had transformed from tormentor to advocate, spending countless hours repairing relationships she'd damaged. The woman who'd once embodied corporate cruelty now led employee satisfaction surveys that consistently ranked Phoenix Sterling among the best places to work. The morning routine included something Maureen had added to her schedule 3 months ago: a company-wide address where any employee could raise concerns directly with leadership. Today, a custodial worker named Elena Vasquez stood at the podium, the same Elena from Maureen's subway rides years earlier. "I just wanted to say," Elena told the assembled crowd, "that working here feels different now, like we matter." That afternoon, Maureen drove to Greenwood Cemetery, where she'd avoided going for 8 years. Emma's headstone was simple: Emma Robinsons, beloved daughter, aged. Maureen knelt beside the grave, placing fresh flowers and pulling out her phone to show Emma's photo the way she had countless times in her apartment. "I did it, sweetheart," she whispered. "I finally figured out how to use power to lift people up instead of climbing over them." The wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time since the accident, Maureen felt something approaching peace. Phoenix Sterling employed 32,000 people now, but more importantly, those people felt valued, respected, and heard. Marcus appeared beside her, offering silent support as he had for 8 years. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Maureen stood, brushing dirt from her knee. Home was no longer an anonymous apartment or a corner office. It was the place where she could be both powerful and compassionate, where Emma's memory lived in every decision to choose humanity over profit. "Yes," she said, taking one last look at her daughter's grave. "I'm ready." As they walked away, Maureen Robinsons, no longer hiding, no longer ashamed, stepped fully into the light of a future built on redemption rather than revenge, on lifting others rather than climbing alone. The phoenix had truly risen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.